Winston Churchill, the man who wouldn't surrender. You know, there are moments in history when everything hangs by a thread, when the fate of millions, perhaps the entire world, depends on one person's decision to either give up or keep fighting. May 1940 was one of those moments, and the man standing at that crossroads was a 65-year-old with a cigar, a lisp, and a reputation for being absolutely impossible to work with. His name was Winston Churchill, and he had just become Prime Minister of Britain at precisely the worst possible moment in human history. The Nazis were winning, France was about to fall, America wasn't coming to help, and almost everyone in his own government wanted to negotiate peace with Hitler. Almost everyone except Churchill. This is the story of the man who looked at the abyss and said, "Not today." Let me take you back to November 30th, 1874, to Blenheim Palace, one of the grandest estates in all of England. This is where Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill entered the world 2 months premature, born in a cloakroom during a ball because his mother went into labor unexpectedly. Even his birth was dramatic and refused to wait for a proper setting. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a prominent politician with syphilis that would eventually destroy his mind. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was a beautiful American socialite who had more interest in her social calendar than in raising her son. Winston would spend his entire life desperately seeking the approval of parents who barely noticed he existed. Young Winston was sent away to boarding school, as was customary for boys of his class, but unlike other privileged children, he was absolutely miserable. At St. George's School, he was beaten so severely by the headmaster that he developed behavioral problems. The school was brutal, and Winston was not an obedient child. He had a speech impediment, a lisp that made him the target of mockery. He struggled with Latin. He wasn't particularly athletic, and he was red-haired, chubby, and stubborn as a mule. But even then, something burned inside him. When he did well in subjects he loved, like English and history, he excelled beyond everyone else. He could memorize 1,200 lines of Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome without error. His teachers noted that he only learned what he wanted to learn, but when he wanted to learn something, he was unstoppable. His relationship with his father was heartbreaking. Lord Randolph was convinced Winston was stupid, destined for failure. He wrote letters to Winston's headmaster asking if there was any hope for the boy. Can you imagine reading those letters? Your own father asking strangers if you're worth the effort? But instead of breaking him, this rejection forged something harder inside Winston. He would prove them all wrong. He would make them remember his name. At 13, Winston looked at his collection of 1,500 toy soldiers and decided he wanted to be in the army. Not because he was particularly suited for it, but because it seemed the only path his father might respect. He failed the entrance exam to Sandhurst, the British Military Academy, twice. On his third attempt, he barely scraped by. His father sent him a letter dripping with disappointment, saying that Winston had barely passed and would never amount to anything significant. Lord Randolph died in 1895, his mind destroyed by disease, still convinced his son was a failure. Winston was 20 years old, and he had lost any chance of ever earning his father's approval. But something interesting happened. With his father gone, Winston stopped trying to please anyone but himself. He became a cavalry officer and immediately started looking for wars to fight in. Not because he was particularly bloodthirsty, but because war meant glory, and glory meant recognition, and recognition meant he mattered. He went to Cuba as a journalist to cover a rebellion against Spanish rule. He was in Cuba on his 21st birthday, experiencing his first combat, and he discovered something remarkable about himself. He wasn't afraid. Bullets zinged past him, men died around him, and Winston Churchill felt absolutely alive. He also discovered he had a gift for writing. His dispatches from Cuba were vivid, exciting, and popular. People wanted to read what Winston Churchill had to say. Then he went to India with his regiment, and while other officers were playing polo and drinking, Winston was reading. He read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, all 8 volumes. He read Plato and Aristotle. He read Darwin and Schopenhauer. He was giving himself the education he felt he'd missed, building his own mind into a weapon. And he kept writing, kept looking for the next war, the next opportunity. In 1898, he joined the Nile Expeditionary Force in Sudan and participated in the Battle of Omdurman, one of the last great cavalry charges in British military history. Picture this: 21-year-old Winston Churchill, charging across the desert with a pistol because his damaged shoulder wouldn't let him properly wield a sword, straight into thousands of dervish warriors. It was suicidal bravery, the kind of thing that gets you killed or makes you a legend. Winston survived and he wrote about it. His book, The River War, was a sensation. But his real moment came in 1899 during the Boer War in South Africa. Churchill went as a journalist, but the armored train he was on was ambushed by Boer fighters. Under heavy fire, Churchill helped rescue wounded soldiers and organize the escape, showing remarkable courage. Then he was captured and taken to a prisoner of war camp in Pretoria. Most men would have waited out the war. Winston Churchill escaped. He climbed over the fence at night, walked and hopped freight trains across 300 miles of enemy territory with no map, no compass, barely any food, and only a vague idea of where the British lines were. He was the most wanted man in South Africa, with wanted posters everywhere. And somehow, miraculously, he made it. He found a British coal mine manager who hid him and eventually got him to safety. When Churchill returned to Britain, he was famous. The story of his escape was in every newspaper. He was 25 years old, and he was a national hero. He leveraged that fame into a political career, getting elected to Parliament in 1900. His career for the next 40 years would be a roller coaster of spectacular successes and devastating failures. He switched political parties, not once but twice, which made many people distrust him. He became Home Secretary, then First Lord of the Admiralty, where he modernized the British Navy just in time for World War I. But then came Gallipoli, and this is where you need to understand something crucial about Churchill. In 1915, he championed a naval attack on the Dardanelles, aimed at knocking Turkey out of the war and opening a supply route to Russia. It was a bold plan, the kind of imaginative strategy that could have shortened the war and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Instead, it became a disaster. Poor execution, indecisive commanders, and bad luck turned Gallipoli into a slaughterhouse. Australian, New Zealand, British, and French troops were cut down on the beaches. Nearly 500,000 casualties. And Winston Churchill was blamed. He was forced to resign in disgrace. Most politicians would have faded away. Churchill did something extraordinary. He asked for a military commission and went to the Western Front to command a battalion in the trenches of France. At 41 years old, an age when most men in power stay far from danger, Churchill went to the most dangerous place on earth. He shared the mud, the rats, the constant shelling, and the fear with common soldiers. He led from the front, walking the trenches, often exposing himself to enemy fire. His men loved him for it, but Gallipoli had marked him. For the next 20 years, many in British politics saw him as a man with brilliant ideas and catastrophically poor judgment. He was kept out of power through the 1920s and most of the 1930s, his warnings about the growing Nazi threat dismissed as warmongering from a has-been. And Churchill did make mistakes during these wilderness years. He opposed Indian independence with arguments that sound appalling today. He misread the Edward VIII abdication crisis. He was seen as out of touch, a relic from the Victorian age. But on one thing, he was absolutely prophetically right. Adolf Hitler was going to plunge the world into war, and Britain needed to prepare. While Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was pursuing appeasement, waving that piece of paper from Munich and declaring peace for our time, Churchill was warning that they were feeding the crocodile, hoping it would eat them last. Nobody wanted to listen. Nobody wanted another war. The memory of World War I was too fresh, too horrible. Surely they could negotiate with Hitler. Surely reasonable men could find peace. They couldn't. Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. Britain declared war 2 days later. Chamberlain was forced to bring Churchill back into government as First Lord of the Admiralty, the same position he'd held 25 years earlier. When the signal went out to the fleet, it said simply, "Winston is back." The Navy cheered. They remembered he'd fought for them, modernized them, believed in them. But the war went badly from the start. The period called the Phony War saw little action in the West. But then in April 1940, Hitler invaded Norway and Denmark. British forces tried to respond but were outmaneuvered and humiliated. Chamberlain's government was collapsing. On May 10, 1940, the same day Hitler launched his blitzkrieg into France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Chamberlain resigned. King George VI didn't want Churchill. Most of the Conservative Party didn't want Churchill. But there was no one else. At 6 p.m. on May 10, 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. He was 65 years old. His entire life had been preparation for this moment. 3 days later, he stood before Parliament and gave the first of his great wartime speeches. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. No false promises, no easy reassurances, just the brutal truth and the determination to fight." You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. His political enemies had expected him to fail, to be overwhelmed by the magnitude of the disaster unfolding in France. Instead, he was energized. Everything in his life had been building to this. Within days, the news from France became catastrophic. The German panzers had broken through at Sedan and were racing to the coast, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and hundreds of thousands of French troops. The French government was in panic. Their military leadership was defeatist, already talking about surrender. And in London, in Churchill's own war cabinet, powerful voices were arguing for negotiation. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, wanted to explore what terms might be available from Hitler through Mussolini's Italy. Halifax was respected, aristocratic, everything Churchill was not. And his position was supported by others in the cabinet. Why not see what Hitler wanted? Perhaps they could keep Britain's independence if they acknowledged German control of Europe. For 3 days in late May 1940, the War Cabinet met repeatedly, and Churchill fought against his own government. We know from the records that these meetings were tense, bitter, and close. Halifax nearly resigned. If he had, Churchill's government would have fallen, and a new prime minister would almost certainly have negotiated with Hitler. The entire future of the war, of the world, hung on these meetings. Think about that. Not on a battlefield, not on grand strategy, but in a room with a handful of tired men debating whether to keep fighting or ask for terms. Churchill gave one of the most important speeches of his life, not to the public, but to the outer cabinet, the ministers who weren't in the war cabinet. He told them that any peace Hitler offered would turn Britain into a slave state, that Hitler's promises were worthless, that the story of Britain would end not in defeat on the battlefield, which could be borne with honor, but in a shameful surrender without fighting. He told them that if Britain fell, the entire world would fall into a new dark age. The ministers rose as one and cheered him. With that support, Halifax's position became untenable. The argument was over. Britain would fight. While Churchill was winning this political battle, a military miracle was unfolding at Dunkirk. The British Expeditionary Force and thousands of French soldiers were trapped on the beaches with their backs to the sea. The Wehrmacht was closing in. Naval officers estimated they might save 30,000 men before the rest were killed or captured. Churchill authorized Operation Dynamo, and then something extraordinary happened. Across southern England, ordinary people took their boats across the channel into hell. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, tugboats, ferries, anything that could float headed to Dunkirk. Under constant air attack from the Luftwaffe, with the beaches being shelled, these civilian vessels shuttled soldiers from the beaches to the larger ships offshore. Over 9 days, they evacuated 338,226 soldiers, not 30,000, 300,000. Churchill knew how to frame this. It was a defeat. The British Army had abandoned all its equipment, its tanks, its artillery, everything. But Churchill spun it as a triumph of the human spirit and a defiance of fate. On June 4th, he gave another speech to Parliament that became legendary. He spoke of fighting on the beaches, fighting on the landing grounds, in the fields and in the streets, fighting in the hills, and never surrendering. His voice was defiant, powerful, absolutely certain. Britain would fight on alone if necessary. Listening to that speech, you can hear why Hitler never invaded. Because how do you conquer a nation whose leader talks like that and means every word? France fell. The French government, which just 20 years earlier had been part of the victorious alliance in World War I, surrendered on June 22, 1940. Britain stood alone. Actually, it's not quite accurate to say Britain stood alone because the Empire, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and others stood with Britain. But in Europe, Britain was isolated. Every nation from Poland to France had either been conquered or was staying neutral. Hitler controlled the continent, and now he turned his attention to finishing off Britain. The Luftwaffe began a campaign to destroy the Royal Air Force and prepare for invasion. This was the Battle of Britain, fought in the skies over southern England during the summer and fall of 1940. Young pilots, most of them barely 20 years old, climbed into their Spitfires and Hurricanes day after day to face the German bomber streams. Churchill visited the RAF operations rooms and watched as the colored markers on the map showed every British squadron in the air, nothing left in reserve, everything committed. He saw how close it was. Years later, he would write, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Those few saved Britain. But Churchill was fighting another battle too, trying to bring America into the war. President Franklin Roosevelt was sympathetic, but America was deeply isolationist. The American people had no desire to die in another European war. Churchill wrote letter after letter to Roosevelt, whom he addressed as former naval person in a bit of code. He asked for destroyers, for weapons, for supplies. Roosevelt stretched American neutrality to its breaking point with programs like Lend-Lease, but he couldn't declare war without Congress. And Churchill knew Britain couldn't win alone. They could survive, they could fight, they could resist, but to actually defeat Nazi Germany, Britain needed America. During this time, Churchill worked in human hours. He would stay up until 3 or 4 in the morning, dictating letters, reading reports, making decisions. He took a nap in the afternoon to recharge, then worked late into the night. He drank, oh how he drank, whiskey and champagne and brandy, though people who worked with him said he was never actually drunk, never impaired. He smoked cigars constantly. He was overweight, 66 years old, under stress that would have killed most men. His doctor worried constantly about his heart, but Churchill seemed to thrive on it. He had spent 40 years preparing for this role, and now that he had it, he was going to give everything. The Blitz began in September 1940. Unable to defeat the RAF, Hitler turned the Luftwaffe against British cities. London was bombed for 57 consecutive nights. Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, every major city was hit. Tens of thousands of British civilians died. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, and Churchill walked through the destruction, wearing his distinctive Homburg hat, chomping on his cigar, giving his V for victory sign to people pulling bodies from collapsed buildings. He didn't hide in a bunker. He went to the bombed areas, looked people in the eye, and shared their danger. The people loved him for it. They called him Winnie, and they believed that if Churchill said they would win, then somehow they would win. In June 1941, everything changed. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Churchill, who had spent years opposing communism, who hated Stalin's regime, immediately pledged British support to Russia. Someone pointed out the irony of the staunch anti-communist allying with Stalin. Churchill replied, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." Ideology didn't matter. What mattered was defeating Hitler. And suddenly, Britain wasn't alone anymore. The Nazi war machine that had steamrolled across Europe was now grinding against the vastness of Russia. Then in December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and America was finally in the war. Churchill later said that he went to bed that night and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. He knew, absolutely knew, that the war was won. It might take years, millions might still die, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. America's industrial might combined with British determination and Russian manpower would crush the Axis powers. It was just a matter of time. Churchill crossed the Atlantic to meet with Roosevelt, and despite their differences, Roosevelt was optimistic and charming while Churchill was pugnacious and emotional. They formed a genuine partnership. They met multiple times over the next few years, in Casablanca, in Quebec, in Cairo, planning the strategy that would win the war. Churchill wanted to attack through southern Europe, what he called the soft underbelly. Roosevelt and his generals wanted a direct assault on France. They argued, they compromised, and they planned D-Day. But Churchill was already thinking about what came after. He could see that Stalin was going to dominate Eastern Europe. He tried to convince Roosevelt that they needed to be careful, that Stalin wasn't a trustworthy ally, that the Soviet Union would be a problem after Hitler was defeated. Roosevelt, dying and exhausted, thought Churchill was being too pessimistic. They could work with Stalin. The United Nations would keep the peace. Churchill wasn't so sure. He traveled constantly during the war, to Moscow to meet with Stalin, to Cairo, to Tehran, across the Atlantic multiple times. He was nearly 70 years old, traveling through war zones, risking German submarines and fighters. He had a heart attack in 1943 and pneumonia several times, but he never stopped. His energy was boundless because he knew this was what he was born for. Every failure in his life, every setback, every humiliation had been preparing him for this moment. He wasn't going to waste it. D-Day came on June 6, 1944. Churchill desperately wanted to watch the landings from a ship offshore. Eisenhower and the King had to practically order him not to go. Can you imagine? The 70-year-old Prime Minister wanting to sail into the most heavily defended coastline in the world just to be there? That was Churchill. He couldn't help himself. He had to be where the action was. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Churchill stood on the balcony of the Ministry of Health building in Whitehall and addressed a massive crowd. He told them this was their finest hour, that they had never given up, that they had saved not just Britain but civilization itself. The crowd sang for "He's a Jolly Good Fellow" and "Land of Hope and Glory." Churchill wept. He had done it. Against all odds, against the advice of so many, he had led Britain through its darkest hour to victory. 2 months later, in July 1945, there was a general election. Churchill expected to win. The British people loved him. He had saved the nation. But the British people wanted change. They were tired of war, tired of sacrifice, and they wanted a government that would focus on domestic issues, healthcare, housing, jobs. Churchill's Conservative Party was defeated in a landslide. Clement Attlee and the Labour Party swept to power. Churchill was devastated. His wife Clementine told him it might be a blessing in disguise. Churchill replied, "At the moment, it seems quite effectively disguised." But he wasn't done. He became leader of the opposition and gave speeches warning about the Soviet threat. In March 1946, At Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, he gave a speech that defined the coming Cold War. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. People criticized him for being too harsh, too warlike. But within a few years, everyone realized he'd been right again. In 1951, at age 76, Churchill became Prime Minister again. His second term was less dramatic than his first. How could it not be? But he continued to work for peace, trying to ease tensions between the East and West. He finally retired in 1955 at age 80, after serving as Prime Minister for nearly 9 years total. He spent his final decade writing, painting, and enjoying his home at Chartwell. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953. He wrote a 6-volume history of World War II that remains magnificent, though we now know he shaped the narrative to make himself look better. But then again, he'd earned that right. He died on January 24th, 1965, at age 90. He had outlived most of his enemies and many of his friends. He received a state funeral, the first for a non-royal since Gladstone in 1898. His coffin traveled on a boat up the Thames, and the cranes along the docks bowed in tribute as he passed. So what do we make of Winston Churchill? He was far from perfect. His views on empire and race were appalling by today's standards. He made serious mistakes: Gallipoli, his opposition to Indian independence, and numerous smaller errors in judgment. He could be impossible to work with, egotistical, and dismissive of others' ideas. He drank too much, worked his staff to exhaustion, and was prone to what he called his black dog, periods of depression that could be debilitating. But in May 1940, when it mattered most, when the fate of civilization hung in the balance, Winston Churchill was exactly the right man in exactly the right place. His entire life had been preparation for that moment. Every failure had taught him resilience. Every setback had taught him persistence. His years in the political wilderness had taught him that being right mattered more than being popular. And when the moment came, he didn't hesitate. He didn't calculate the odds. He simply refused to surrender. That's what makes Churchill's story so powerful. He wasn't a perfect hero. He was a flawed, complicated, difficult man who happened to have exactly the qualities needed at the moment of maximum danger. His stubbornness, which had ruined him at Gallipoli, saved the world in 1940. His romantic view of British history and glory, which made him seem like an anachronism in the 1930s, gave him the moral certainty to stand against Hitler when more pragmatic men wanted to negotiate. His gift for language, honed through decades of writing, allowed him to rally a nation with nothing but words. History is full of what-ifs, and we can't know for certain what would have happened if someone else had been Prime Minister in May 1940. But we can make an educated guess. Halifax would have negotiated. Chamberlain would have been overwhelmed. Almost anyone else would have seen the rational case for cutting a deal with Hitler while Britain still had leverage. And if Britain had made peace in 1940, if Hitler had secured his western flank, the course of history would have been unimaginably different. Nazi Germany might have defeated the Soviet Union. There would have been no D-Day, no liberation of Europe. The Holocaust would have consumed even more lives. America might never have fully entered the war. The world we live in today would be unrecognizable and darker beyond measure. But that didn't happen because one man refused to accept the reasonable, rational choice. Winston Churchill looked at the abyss and said no. Not today. Not ever. We will fight. And his refusal to surrender changed everything. That's why we still tell his story. That's why his speeches still stir something in us. Because he proved that one person can make a difference, that courage and determination and the refusal to give up can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Churchill once said, "Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." His entire life embodied that principle. He failed repeatedly and spectacularly, but he never stopped trying, never stopped believing he had something to offer. And when the moment came when everything depended on having the courage to continue, he was ready. That's the story of Winston Churchill, the man who wouldn't surrender. Flawed, complicated, difficult, brilliant, and at the crucial moment, indispensable. He saved Britain. And in saving Britain, he saved the world.